So The Spiritual Child is a book that is 15 years in the making. I come to this as a scientist, a clinical scientist, and when I started out in the late 1990s, there was not a peep of spiritual science or clinical science in all the literature on children and adolescents. I was there in an inner city hospital working with some of the sickest and most underprivileged children in New York City, and yet the notion that the deepest resource would come from a deep spiritual connection to God, Allah, the higher power, the universe, whatever word one might use, was not even mentioned. And in fact, there were times when patients would say, "Will you come with me? Will you come with me, Dr. Miller? Come with me into the kitchen. Come with me into the closet here. Will you pray with me?" So the patient didn't feel safe talking about her or his relationship to the higher power, to the universe. The patient didn't feel that the deepest source of thriving and wellness was permittable in a mental health setting. And so it seemed to me that the way to be part of the sea change within clinical science was to speak in the language that the field was comfortable and willing to accept, which was the language of science. So I started out then in about 1997 looking into what does science have to say about spirituality in the path of development. And might spirituality be for children and adolescents a source of wellness, a source of protection, resilience, and ultimately a source of thriving? The first wave of this research in my lab and fellow labs around the world produced findings that were so shocking in their strength, so great in the magnitude of what was being said about spiritual life, that the field didn't know what to say. Let me give you a taste of this. We ran a study in 1997 looking at what happens if a child and his or her mother share in spiritual life. And what we found was that if a child and his or her mother simply share a deep spiritual engagement, a deep sense of shared spiritual identity, that child is 80% protected against suffering a major depression during the window of risk, age 16 to 26 years old. We then went back and repeated that study. What if the torch is passed not just from mother to child, but in time from mother to child and then her own child, 3 generations? And if the spiritual torch is passed 3 generations, the grandchild is 90% protected against major depression. There's nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly helpful to a child. There's no greater wellspring of health and thriving as a deep spiritual life passed through the love of generations. So this finding was published in the most rigorous peer-reviewed journals within child and adolescent psychiatry, the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. The finding came out, you could have heard a pin drop. Right. This went on for years, right? One study after the next. And it gradually became clear that we needed to have a sea change in our understanding of child development that listened to the data and put at the center of development spiritual life. And that is what in The Spiritual Child I've done. I've brought in all of the science from the past 15 years, my lab and fellow labs, and painted a portrait of the possibility that is our birthright, that is in our nature, of a developmental model that has at its core spirituality. What are some of the assumptions? The first is that every single one of us is born inherently spiritual. Spirituality is innate. Now, that's not my opinion. That is a scientific fact. If you look at twin studies, twins raised together are compared with twins raised apart to look at the degree to which any trait, whether it's temperament or IQ or anything under the sun, is heritable versus shaped by environment. There is a very strong heritable, innate contribution to spiritual life, and in particular to the transcendent relationship, a relationship to God, Allah, the higher power, whatever your word may be. What else do we know from science? That spirituality sustained is associated with essentially a more thriving brain. We published in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry, a study that showed that when people get to be my age, if there's been decades of a sustained spiritual life, whatever faith tradition or outside of faith tradition that may be, the brain is literally thicker. It's much more like a lush Amazon tree and much less like a withering tree stuck in the sidewalk. And where is it lush? It is lush in specifically those regions where instead of being thick, it would be thin in people with recurrent depression. Right? What else do we know? We know that the spiritually engaged brain, if I invite you in, you very beautiful spiritual engaged people, to the lab and put an EEG on your head and said simply relax and close your eyes, the spiritually engaged brain over time hits a rest point, a setting point, which simply in a relaxed moment measures as having the same wavelength as an actively meditating monk, high amplitude alpha. Alpha has another name in another field. It's Schumann's constant, which is the electromagnetic field around the Earth, the energy of nature, of the Earth's crust. The spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the same frequency as nature, as the Earth's crust. The felt sense of oneness, the felt sense of relationship, is, in terms of the fabric, the physical build of reality, accurate. So knowing this, knowing that we're naturally spiritual, knowing that sustained spiritual life leads to a thriving body and thriving brain, knowing that over time spiritual life makes us truly one with nature, what more would we want for a child than to support our birthright? What more would we want for a child than to take the heritably endowed natural spirituality and support each and every child, certainly our own, towards a life where the lead foot is anchored in spiritual reality. So I'd like to invite you to ask questions and have a discussion. Sound good? Thank you. Were there some spiritual practices which were particularly studied or any found to have a particular strength in cultivating spiritual life? It's a marvelous question. The study that I shared with you that we published in JAMA Psychiatry that showed a thicker cortex in people with a sustained spiritual life, those very same regions of the brain shown to be thick in people with a sustained spiritual life from a sample in the United States that was heavily Judeo-Christian, right, were the very same regions of the brain shown to be thick in people with a sustained meditation practice as compared with people unfamiliar with meditation from a non-Judeo-Christian heritage. So it seems that the method through which we access transcendence is not important. What is important is the sustained relationship with the loving guiding life force, the loving guiding universe. And that whether it's prayer or meditation, at least in terms of how the brain looks and other biomarkers, we're getting there really to the same foundational, same place through ostensibly different paths. The question was about my own spiritual beliefs and how it affected writing the book. As a child, the spiritual reality was foremost. That was the bedrock. Those were the axioms that underscored the way life unfolded. So it was clear to me as a child that, for instance, if we love, then our lives in the physical world open up differently. It was clear to me as a child that we know things before they happen. And I think this is clear to many children, and probably nearly all children. And yet it was surprising to me to sit through school, and I loved my school and appreciate my teachers very much, and never hear a peep about the axioms of reality. And as my education continued and I went to college and graduate school, I still didn't hear a peep about the axioms, the spiritual axioms that are bedrock to reality. And it seemed to me that science is as good an instrument as any, a lens, to start to look into the unfolding of reality. That science is as interesting and as helpful and as powerful as where we point the lens. And we can point the lens to the stars, or we could point it into the sandbox. But it's a great lens. scientific community about the study of spirituality, about the investigation of spirituality. I found that my heroes, who were passionate scientists, were curious beyond measure, and hungry for new ideas and new knowledge. So the people who, in my professional life, I admired most were open-minded, passionate scientists of all decades of life, but often very senior, who, when they saw the findings, when they saw the numbers, were amazed. Now, I certainly encountered naysayers, but never from passionately curious scientists. Passionately curious scientists wanted to know more. So I think there's a very helpful distinction that you're raising and is so valuable, which is science as a lens, a mode of inquiry, versus the very frequent, perhaps misunderstanding, as you point out, of science as a specific body of ideas, and in particular in the 20th century as secular, materialist, mechanistic ideas, right? But science as a lens, as a way of looking into reality, is marvelous. But all good scientists talk about receiving the questions in rather direct, perhaps spiritually inspired or intuitive ways. So that the formation of the question in science is very often through a sudden realization or a dream. The formation of the question is often through inspiration that every single one of us on earth has access to. And it's the unifying of the deep knowing of the heart and intuition with then the follow-through, the rigorous, standardized inquiry of science, uniting head and heart, that offers this type of synthesis. Thank you. About how do you essentially welcome spirituality into the psychotherapy, treatment, healing process. And as you perhaps suggest, spirituality has a life of its own. Right. So if we simply honor and regard with awe and interest its presence as it starts to emerge, the child's natural spiritual awareness, it gains momentum. I'll share with you a story. I had a client, a very, very poor girl, who brought herself for treatment at the age of 12. So it's very rare that in an inner city children's depression clinic, a child would bring herself at 12. Usually you see an adult by their side. And when she came in, she shared her story of what had brought her there, which was that her father, who she adored, the sun and the moon revolved around her father, had been murdered by two men who he knew, who came into his store. He ran a corner deli, and they sold alcohol and killed him. And they took away her world. It was tragic. And she came in mourning, right, in deep mourning for her father, and also now for the life that had become hers, which is she moved into a very cold, walled-off world with her mother, who was an addict, and her grandmother, who was quite harsh and abusive. So there she was, and the world that she'd loved and the person that she'd loved was gone, and she was in a desolate world. And in this desolate world, she was locked away from friends, locked away from any interest whatsoever in boys, and was only allowed to go to school, come home, go to bed, locked in her room. So this was really a tragedy, and her growth in treatment could not compare to the tragic reality of her life. And she came in each day, and we went from 0 to about a 6, from 1 to 10. And then after months, found ourselves still at 6, not getting better. Until one day, she came in, and she was jumping. She said, Dr. Miller, you're not going to believe this, you're not going to believe this. And I said, well, what? And she said, well, my grandmother and my mother finally allowed me to go to a school dance. It was chaperoned, and my brother's uncle took me, and they watched me the whole time, and I was totally safe. And there I was, and she said, and for the first time I met a boy. I said, you met a boy? And she said, yes, and he was so kind, and he was so dear, and his name, I'll change the name, of course, was marvelous. And I said, well, marvelous? That's wonderful. She said, but don't you see? And I said, what? And she said, well, marvelous was my father's name. And I said, and what do you make of that? And she said, well, my father is watching over me. My father's with me. My father sent marvelous. And that shifted her from a 6 to a 10, which then over time, you know, when she went back to 8, was maintained between 8 and 10, because marvelous was with her. And he wasn't with her because she interpreted it that way. She knew in the bedrock of reality that her father was with her. And this desolate world was not the finitude of her life. She was still with the blessing and the love and the guidance and the watchful eye and protection of her father. So this is the child's natural spirituality. And when we go, wow, and when we, in our heart, feel, what a blessing, the child, the wise child, knows the spiritual reality to be true. And from then on, that was the bedrock on which we walk. How do parents who perhaps have questioned, or your word was lost, their own spirituality, turn now to their child and support that in their child? It's a marvelous question. And in fact, many parents will say things such as, I believed in nothing, nothing at all. But then my child was born. And now I know there's something more, but I don't know how to talk about it, and I don't know where to begin. And I don't want to perhaps impose my confusion or my buy-in or my rejection of spiritual life onto my child. I think the child is the source. I think that every child is born a spiritual child. And the child essentially is a wellspring of energy and reboots the family. So when we really hear the child, when we say, wow, and when we let her or him ask the question with us as witness, right, and let the child open the door for the family, the child is the source. We don't have to be experts as parents, and in fact, we don't have to know anything or believe anything, and an ardent atheist can raise a spiritual child if we truly show up with deep interest and love and respect for what they say. And in time, you know, if you have 2 violins, one in one corner and one in your arm, and you pluck the C note over there vibrates. And in that way, I think the child wakes us up as parents. Our C note vibrates, and our natural spiritual instrument starts to awaken. The child does this in many ways. Their energy and spirit alone, their presence, their love, the blinding love of a newborn. The cosmic blinding love of the newborn. But then the questions they ask and the way they talk to animals, and you know, their deep certainty about deep spiritual truths that they'll pronounce. Can anyone share a moment where a child blew your mind? I invite you to think into that. It absolutely blew your mind. So I think when we simply show up and honor as real the child's spiritual questions, I don't need an answer, but if I stay tuned and hold his or her gaze, they aren't actually often asking for the answer. They're opening the door, and they continue to unfold and have a lot to say themselves. We can follow their cue. You know, come with me, I want to see the burial ground. Come with me, I want to sing with the rabbi or go to mass. Come with me. You know, they love to pray. They love to meditate. I met with a woman who works with children. She's Sufi, and she says the way a 3-year-old naturally moves into prayer in her Sufi community, the whole movement of the body is not just second nature, it's first nature to the child. So the child loves to connect with spirit, and in that sense is the guide. What she says, she is all the more sure it is real. You have in no way stifled that. You've joined in her deep knowing of her spiritual connection, her spiritual access. Many cultures, as you know the child to be spiritually aware, know the child to be spiritually present. And even, for instance, I'll share with you a story from the United States. There's a small town in rural Texas where a young girl, a 14-year-old, had a dream of a tragedy that in this small town someone had died in a car wreck. And as you might imagine, the next day there was in fact this tragedy and a death, right? Her dream was shared with this small town in Texas, and the people came together in their faith tradition in a small church and asked her before the community to recount her dream. Okay? And when she did, it was treated with deep respect, deep sanctity, a sacred dream, and everyone felt a sense of being supported by the sacred presence, supported by God, because this dream, right, was a testament, a witness to the presence of Spirit. Now, the child as a messenger is understood in so many cultures, right? And I shared this story with my students at Columbia University, and a girl from India raised her hand, and she said, well, in my village in India, a girl of age 11 and 12 is known to be particularly spiritually attuned. And when we look at the science in our lab, we've seen that when girls hit 11 and 12 and emerge into puberty, they augment, they rise in their capacity for spirituality, and it becomes all the more important to their health and thriving, and all the more precious, and all the more important to protect. So what you've done for her is the most important thing you could have done, which is to listen with a certainty that what she says is true and from a sacred source. Yeah. And one more point to your question. There have been lovely studies done where parents keep journals of the family's spiritual and religious life. And what the journals show is that about 50% of the time, in very religious families, it's actually the child who initiates a spiritual discussion. And the more that a parent pays attention, and in this case writes it down, the more the child asks. So the child is exquisitely sensitive and attuned to our statement through our interest that what they say is real and matters. Yeah. In my work, I've consistently seen very spiritually present children. I've seen children who were absolutely, and particularly teenagers, delighted that somebody finally asked about their spiritual experience. Because naturally, with puberty, there's a spiritual awakening for every child, and a sense of being almost a spiritual scientist, where you see the connections and you see the oneness or the links in life. And there's a deep understanding of synchronicity, of calling, of purpose, of all the spiritual principles in our human lives, and yet no one talks about it. And that's very, very surprising. It feels almost as if it were a hidden secret to many teenagers. So to simply be asked, have you had any meaningful spiritual experiences? Or do you have any feelings or connections in your heart and intuition? They are overjoyed, and they respond by saying, well, yes, But as much as they're aware of the spiritual presence in and through daily life, they're equally aware that nobody's talking about it. And that we can change. We can create a warm and interested environment, irrespective of our own spiritual experiences, that honors the child's own spiritual path. We can adopt a child-centered point of view, as we do in many forms of education, that looks into each child for who she or he is and honors their own spiritual emergence in their own language. I had a brilliant doctoral student who came to me with the following story. As a child, he was a very spiritual child and connected very deeply to his mother, very spiritual mother. And yet their faith community shunned homosexuality. And he was aware, as he grew older, that he was gay, and knowing that it was unwelcomed made him feel diminished and cut off from who he really is. And with frustration and confusion, he threw away his religion, but with that, the baby went with the bathwater, and he threw away his own spiritual life. And he felt disconnected to the sacred presence. He felt cut off from God. And he continued in his path with frustration until he really felt ready, knowing himself deeply, to come out as a gay man. And when he came out as a gay man, he felt whole, he felt strong, He felt attuned and aligned. And the self, as an instrument, is ultimately our only way of knowing spiritual life, right? The self as an instrument, like the C note on the violin, is our only way of knowing spiritual life. So with a whole, healed, strong instrument, having come out, having claimed his life as a gay man, he started to have spiritual experiences. And he started to reconnect with, in his language, God. And he started to have a strong personal spiritual life that led him to divinity school. And after that, to becoming a therapist. And now he works with gay men, focusing on gay parents who are focusing on spiritual life. So he had a deep journey. But it's a very important question, because in the adolescent emergence, in the adolescent individuation, what is me, what is not me, right? A rejection of who I am in my incarnate packaging in this life, whether it's my sexual orientation or my anything, keeps me from being able to use my instrument. And that needs to be healed and fixed. I'll share with you one other story. I had a brilliant African-American student who felt enormous pain from having been racially discriminated against as a child. And when she healed and, in her case, took a pilgrimage to Africa where her ancestors had been taken, and healed and had a profound experience as a black woman, she said, I first claimed myself as a black woman and then started having a strong sense of relationship to my higher power. So the self in all of our wholeness and all of our uniqueness needs to emerge so that we can then feel a deep alignment and connection with all creation. There's a few related studies. Yeah, it's wonderful. And the global question is about what is the role of parental bonding in the formation of spirituality, and how might parental bonding, in a sense, compare, is really what you're asking, to spiritual life. It's a marvelous question. First of all, the taste of pure, unconditional parental love is about 60% of the way towards spiritual formation in the child. So when we look at what ingredients go into a spiritually supported child, a child who at the age of 18, upon graduating from high school, has a strong spiritual compass, it is equally a transparent spiritual life, a vital spiritual life in the family, equally that, as it is pure, unconditional parental love. So really, in the formation of a spiritual child, there's equal contribution of parental love, non-conditional, pure parental love, and parental spiritual life and familial spiritual life. And in the spiritual child, I call this the field of love, the intertwining of family love with family spiritual life. And in fact, it is the love in and through the parents that is, I think, in its essence, a sacred spiritual presence. Now, to get to your question, when we look at children who have not experienced parental love, so children whose parents are profoundly unable to love or absent, we find that the child will naturally turn to the sacred presence. And that's been found in my lab, but several other labs as well. So a child who has never had or who has lost a loving parent will start to spontaneously talk to God, will start to seek out spiritual guidance from another adult. And I'll share with you a study we did. We looked at children of opiate-addicted moms. Opiate-addicted moms, as compared to a national rate of about 70 or 80% of people who are spiritual, opiate-addicted moms, only 4% said that spirituality was important. So the suffering is quite profound in this community of long-standing addicts. And yet, when you look at their children, the children had the same rate of spirituality as would be found in a national sample. So the child at mean age 11 had not yet lost their birthright, had not yet lost their natural spirituality. And in fact, when we looked more deeply at these children, it turned out that these children had locked on to a loving, consistent adult in their life and adapted the spiritual language, adapted the spiritual understanding of the healthiest adult in their life. So there's a natural process of selective spiritual socialization where the child follows the thread of pure, stable love, true love, and drinks in the spiritual life of the person, whether it's a grandparent, whether it's it could be a foster parent, right? As long as there's consistent, steady love. So it's really quite remarkable. We come with a spiritual compass that points the direction of truth. Contribution to our spiritual life, a sort of biological clock, a coming online that comes with puberty, and specifically fertility. So it's not just age, it's triggered by puberty.
I was wondering if it's something that you can also see, a change in the brain?
It's a wonderful question. Those studies specifically have yet to be done. What we have found is that when there's secondary sexual characteristics indicating puberty, so change in the body, onset of fertility, the depth of spiritual life increases as measured by self-report. And the protective benefits, the power of spirituality to protect against deep suffering, deep major depression, addiction, anxiety, risk-taking, increases by 50% as well. This is our birthright. It is always a quarter inch under the surface. And I know this. I know this through the data, and I know this through my work with people. That, I will work with moms who feel very disconnected to spiritual life. Very disconnected. And simply within the matter of our first hour together, particularly in a group, they are enlivened. Their eyes light up. The spiritual life is immediately within our reach. And truly validating, there's practices and exercises through which we can access our natural spirituality. There's, even if we were to repeat awkwardly a prayer from our childhood or try a meditation practice, it comes. It comes, with interest and love and patience. It comes. It is there for all of us. It is never too late. Now, there are times where it's post-traumatic growth is very common through deep suffering. We can have, the container of what's false will crack, and in deep suffering we connect with what's more real. And very often you will see post-traumatic spiritual growth in people. But there are also times where simply it comes from within. And there are chapter breaks in our life where the life we've lived no longer fills the cup. With puberty, with adult individuation, we have names for these things: midlife crisis, sophomore slump. And yet, really, what these chapter breaks are spiritual emergence at the level of soul and body as one. Spiritual emergence in the chapters of our lives, which far too often are not honored and not supported in Western culture. And in those moments feel like a deep dive into emptiness, ennui, meaningless depression. And yet the answer is the awakening. It's a knock on the door for the spiritual path. It's come. And as this door slams and the life I thought I had isn't there, really as I turn, I see there's a bright horizon. There's a whole nother life, which is far beyond what I might have imagined. So this is our birthright, every one of us. It's in Jung, of course, but it was lost by much of Western psychology. It's held in the science. It's held in long-term clinical course studies, genetic studies, brain studies. It's there if we really look honestly at the numbers and then can weave it together into a developmental model across our lifespans. It is always there for us, spiritual life. Thank you for asking. The book actually was very well received by publishers, and a number of publishers were interested. I think that society, this time in our collective, is a time where people are ready to look into the spiritual reality, to the bedrock. And it's actually, I think, met with joy and relief, that we can let go of the false identification with materialism. And there's almost a sense of being validated. Almost everyone has a spiritual experience, and some of them are quite profound. Many people have very profound spiritual experiences that are tucked into a dresser drawer in the back of their mind. But actually that experience is the opening through which our spiritual path opens and unfolds. And when spirituality is validated, and in this case, through the parallel lens of science, I think people are encouraged. It is part of our biological clock. And with puberty, there's a hunger to know meaning and purpose. What is my meaning and purpose, and what is the meaning and purpose? Right? And when we take these questions seriously, they are quite profound, because the teen really, truly doesn't know if there is meaning or purpose and what that can be. So they are all in, right? And if you can return in your life to being a teenager and really wondering if there's any point to your life, that's quite a all in. It's a very vital question. So the messengers who bring spiritual guidance are extremely important. And for the most part, the adolescent is the best spiritual scientist of any of us in any decade. The adolescent feels intensely. Emotion is bright red, and that allows the sort of growth, the quest, the hunger for what's true spiritually. The adolescent abhors hypocrisy, right? And can smell it at a distance, right? If I'm not living my truth, what good is my message as a parent or a teacher? If I am living my truth, the message is sound, right? And the teen will often judge a message by the messenger, which makes sense to me, right? So the teen is an exquisite seeker. And the goal of adolescence is to unite the hunger for the transcendent connection of the heart with the inquiry of the head, right, in spiritual individuation. This makes the teen also vulnerable to bad messengers. And bad messengers can come in many forms. The worst messenger is no messenger, because the teen goes shopping. And in my generation, it was Dungeons and Dragons. But there's 1,000 nihilistic, unpleasant, unhelpful renditions of so-called spirituality. Spirituality is loving and good. Spirituality is life-giving and procreative. It's not destruction. But a messenger can twist and turn that. And a teen, more than any of us, can be susceptible to a manipulative messenger, a messenger who guides him or her down the wrong path. And I think we need to be watchful of the messengers, many of whom don't help the teen in a more banal way by simply saying nothing or mocking spiritual life. That's far more common, right? And in that way disaggregate the spiritual emergence of the teen from all other lines of development. If a teen doesn't think spiritual life is real, or feels humiliated or mocked or diminished for seeking spiritual life or feeling spirituality, we're cutting them off at their knees. We're keeping them from, in the book I talk about a spiritual hub. Command Central is really spiritual command central. I'll give you an example. In the book I talk about a young man who at the age of 11 was introduced to pornography. And here was this little boy who was the golden boy of his community, and he was very active in his religious community, and he was in class leadership. But yet he had this split-off dark secret of pornography. And it got more and more consuming and more obsessive, and he felt more and more unworthy before the sacred presence, more and more unworthy before what he called God. And to feel out of the light of God is a very cold place for a child. To feel unworthy is a very cold place for a child. And in his healing, he reached a point where he learned to ask from his spiritual core, what say you of sexuality? What say you of pornography? And his healing had to do with taking the split-off, dark, hidden sexual life and bringing it into the light of day of his sacred heart. He now says, as a young man, all I wanted as a teen was to be asked, what does your spiritual heart say about sexuality? He wanted to be a unified person with a spiritual command central.